So much was happening behind the scenes. We can't even begin to cover it tonight. They actually had to reinforce the floors of the Capitol because of all the paperwork related to Watergate. So there was the procedural. Then there was the personal aspect that were just as important to this committee. There's a great podcast out there. It's called Slow Burn. It's from Slate. It describes the events of 1973 and 74. And in one episode, they speak with a former representative. Her name is Elizabeth Holtzman. She was on the committee at just 31 years old. They talked about the difficulty of even defining the impeachable offense in the Constitution of high crimes and misdemeanors.
So what was a high crime exactly? Were the framers of the Constitution referring to a specific category of criminal offenses? Or was a high crime just a really bad thing that a president shouldn't do, even though it's not necessarily illegal? Holtzman thought the answer was clear. The framers obviously couldn't have been making reference to the U.S. Criminal Code because there was no U.S. Criminal Code when they wrote the Constitution.
High crime and misdemeanor was really a political crime. It's not a normal crime. It's not like shooting your wife or your husband or running somebody over because you're drunk, but it's an abuse of power.
As Nixon watched his fate play out day after day in this telenovela starring 38 House members, he knew that procedure mattered just as much as the personal. Members themselves had to figure out the law and then had to decide if their constituents would support their vote. Being on the committee brought a lot of notoriety, but also risk. I spoke with Neyfakh, who produced the Slow Burn podcast and hosted it, to hear more about how the Nixon Impeachment Committee did its work under incredible strain and glaring spotlights. Do you see parallels or not between the 1970s and 2018?
Well, what set that in motion was the Saturday Night Massacre, which was a quite famous incident in October of '73 in which Nixon basically ordered the firing of the special prosecutor at the time, Archibald Cox, basically motivated a bunch of people in the House of Representatives to undertake an impeachment inquiry. They needed to figure out from scratch, like, what is impeachment? How does it work? What is an impeachable offense? What is a high crime and misdemeanor? Like, what did the framers mean by that?
And then it sort of hit this tipping point to where members of the House realized we have to take this more seriously. That does not seem to be where we are right now with the Mueller investigation and anything he could possibly return when it comes to the White House or the Trump team.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions that people have been asking themselves is, how far do these parallels go? Like, can we assume that if Trump does the sort of analogous thing, which is fire Bob Mueller, would that cause the same kind of outcry in the populace, as you said, and would it cause his fellow Republicans to support, an impeachment inquiry? You can imagine all these things happening, but it's hard to picture anyone really caring like 2 days later.
Not every Democrat at the time in the House was against the president, and not every Republican was for him.
That's right. I think, we now see Congress as a body of, made up of two parties who will vote along party lines and will always do what's good for the party. And back then, it was more complicated. There were moderate Republicans, there were liberal Republicans, there were conservative Democrats who supported Nixon and whose constituents voted for Nixon's. And so you had these seven guys who spent, those I think it was roughly 6 months or so, like really trying to just make that decision. And they didn't really know about each other. Some of them sort of had a buddy, like they knew one other guy who was wrestling with it in the same way they were. But mostly it wasn't until the very end when they kind of, through a series of events that I don't need to go into now, but they found each other. And it turned out that all seven of them had, come to the conclusion after analyzing the evidence that they did need to support impeachment. They were just so conscious of the weight of what they were doing, the gravity of what they were doing, that it was this unthinkable thing to remove a president. Like, the guy had won in a landslide, not so long ago, and this was going to be reversing the will of the people, and they really took that seriously.
Do you think we're living in the middle of a slow burn right now, or do you think, it's just going to be a constant burning from this day forward, pretty much whoever's in office? I
think it is good to remember that it took, as long as it did, it was about 2 years and 2 months between the break-in at the Watergate and Nixon's resignation in August of '74. And I think that, my conclusion after getting to the end of the story was like, this ending was so not inevitable. There were so many points along the way where it could have gone sideways and it could have easily gone the other way. And we got somewhat lucky that there were individuals within those institutions who were willing to sort of turn the gears of history. And I don't think we can assume that they'll sort of turn themselves.